Happy to move on to session 3. How can we better prepare for the next pandemic? Future innovations in vaccine manufacturing. But first, can we show the results of the last poll? So with 50% of the responses have been voted for know-how and skills as the biggest barrier to vaccine manufacturing in developing countries, followed by IP barriers at 19%, access to raw materials at 14%, and regulatory challenges at 10%. Thanks to everyone for voting. It's really interesting results there. So I'd like to hand over to our first speaker of session 3, Matthew Duchars. He's Chief Executive Officer of Vmic, that is the Vaccines Manufacturing Innovation Center. Matthew's in an executive office with over 30 years of experience in biotechnology. He has worked on a wide variety of vaccine and therapeutic platforms, as well as medical countermeasures for multiple indications, including anthrax, plague, Ebola, smallpox, Marburg, dengue, Zika, as well as radiation and chemical agents. So off to you, Matthew.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction and for the invitation to speak today. I apologise slightly in advance if there's a little bit of background noise. The trouble with working from home, of course, is you can't predict when the council is going to start cutting the grass verges outside the window. So the tractor's gone past twice so far. Hopefully it will not go past again, but we'll see. Let's just check if I can get the slides to work. Oops, no, oh, yeah, there we go. So a little bit about Vmic to start with. So Vmic, the Vaccine Manufacturing Innovation Center, we've been set up as a not-for-profit company, and we're there primarily to help vaccine developers really through collaborations. The facility itself, the capital to build the facility has been funded through the UK government, particularly through Innovate UK. And the facility is really, it forms part of the national scientific infrastructure that's been put in place through the UK government to support life sciences and in particular vaccines. However, contrary to popular belief, Vmic was not established as a result of COVID-19. It actually predates COVID. So back in 2018, we were funded by UK Innovate to build the Vaccine Manufacturing Innovation Centre. And this was set up really through 3 founding organisations, 3 universities, Oxford University, Imperial College and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And we were supported by 3 really leading players in the vaccine industry. So Cytiva, Johnson & Johnson through Janssen, and Merck MSD. So we have a good stable of vaccine experience, and our time sort of predates, as I said, COVID-19. However, we did get a considerable amount of acceleration funding during the course of the last year. So as the COVID-19 crisis sort of started to unfold, and it became fairly apparent that we were lacking some of the capacity and the idea of Vmic, unfortunately, that it was going to be a year or two too late for the COVID crisis. So the government came along and really said, well, first of all, can you make it a bit bigger so it can actually cover more than its original intent of just a few 2 to 3 million doses in the case of an emergency, but to be able to cover pandemic. So we increased the scale and capacity by about 20-fold. And also, can you accelerate that program and bring it forward? So that's what we did during the course of the last year, and we're now sort of well on with the build, and we'll come on to talk about that in a second, and when the facility will start to come online. In terms of, so what is the purpose of Vmic? What are we here to do? As I think I mentioned right at the start, we're there primarily to help vaccine developers with that sort of transition particularly in the early stages, out of discovery and on towards the clinic, and then that translational science as you go through and on towards commercial scale. So that whole, how do you turn what's a good scientific discovery into something that can be scaled up and would be acceptable for use in humans and can be industrialized and commercialized. So that was always originally our sort of primary purpose. But we're also there to provide a level of resource and knowledge and expertise. So that is to help drive innovation. So we're there to look at ways to improve efficiencies, find new technologies to be able to develop the way that processes are made, products are made through processes. We're there to provide guidance out to not just to industry, but to anyone who's developing vaccines, whether it's academia, whether it's startup companies, whether it's large pharma. We're there as a resource to help provide guidance for that. And thirdly, we're there to provide a level of training as well. So we're there to help essentially broaden and deepen the skill sets within the workforce in the UK, in the life science sector. And that training can extend out to bringing people into the facility, as well as providing training out to people outside of the facility. And then the third purpose, as I mentioned earlier on, is really to provide a level of emergency response and now emergency pandemic response. So as I mentioned, the capacity of the facility was significantly increased from being able to make about 3 million doses of vaccine in a 4 or 5 month period through to being able to make 70 million doses in the same period. So a significant increase in our capacity there. In terms of the facility, so you can see here a picture from actually earlier this year. So the outside of the facility is complete. We're now into the fit out of the facility inside, putting the clean rooms in place, all the sort of heavy fixed equipment, and then moving on towards qualification later on this year. And the facility itself is fairly sizable. It's a 74,000 square foot footprint, so which means absolutely nothing to me until somebody said that's the size of a football pitch or a rugby pitch, depending on what your sporting preference is. So that gives you sort of an idea of the size of the facility, and it goes up for 3.5, 4 stories, so it's quite sizable. And in terms of its capability and what we'll be able to do, so it's really an end-to-end capability, everything from very early stage cell banking, viral banking, development of and manufacture of early preclinical and clinical grade material where we're making perhaps a few hundred doses, right through to scale up to commercial scales of being able to make literally sort of tens of millions of doses. So we do span the whole range from very early, very small, right through to large industrial scale. And the other thing about the facility is it's been designed to be technology agnostic, so that it's not just focused on one particular modality, but we'll be able to do RNA vaccines, DNA vaccines, viral vector vaccines, recombinant subunit vaccines, conjugate vaccines, you name it. We've deliberately designed the facility so that we can work on all of those types of technologies and all independently as well. So we are able to work on several different types of vaccines and vaccine platforms simultaneously. Okay, and I think the other thing to mention here is that so the drug substance, we have a series of suites for manufacture of the bulk drug substance itself that range from small laboratory, almost bench scale for that first in man type of studies, right through to very large sort of industrial scale drug substance suites, and similarly on the fill finish capability. So it's not just about making the bulk vaccine, it's also about filling it. we're able to fill anything from just a few small, small number of doses for early studies, right through to large-scale industrialized production of millions of doses. Okay, so a little bit about the timeline of where we are. So right now, as I mentioned, the facility is being built. So the building is in place, the clean rooms are being put in place, the fixed equipment is starting to go in. We're really looking for the facility to complete all that installation, or the majority of it, through this year, so that we'll be able to open this year with a view to coming online and becoming operational through the course of 2022, and we'll do that in a phased way. And then once we've really established the capability and the capacity there, is then about consolidating on that and making sure that the manufacturer is able to run, and then moving on from there towards being able to do innovation and improve processes as we go forward. Just briefly, a little bit on COVID-19. So we were also quite closely involved with the COVID-19 effort, to not only just in terms of expanding the facility, but also helping to set up a rapid deployment capability. So we actually realized that our facility wasn't going to be ready in time to manufacture vaccine when it was needed for the country over the course of the last year. So we helped to buy our equipment early and worked in partnership with another organisation, Oxford Biomedica, in fact, to help set up a capability there using our equipment in their facility, in their clean rooms, to be able to provide the country with vaccine earlier than anticipated, and that was approved back in October of 2020, which meant that manufacture of vaccine could be completed, ready to go out into people at the end of 2020 and early 2021. And then, conscious of time here a little bit, my last slide, I did want to say a little bit about working with universities and specifically what we've been involved with there. So, as I said, we're setting up now, so we're not sort of we haven't got everything up and running just yet. But what Vmic will do is it will provide capacity, in particular, to help with that early transition out of discovery, where a lot of the work that the academics and universities are doing great stuff with new vaccines that are coming through, and we've heard about some of those today. So what we'll be able to do is help to do that transition and get that those products out and made to GMP and into the clinics early, and in an expeditious and an economic way. We'll be able to provide a level of expertise out to help developers and academics, particularly sort of identify early on what are the right sort of processes that are industrializable or scalable, what are the types of cell cultures or vectors, media components, separation technologies, whatever it might be. Some of those things that you do in the lab are not necessarily easily scalable, so it's important to identify those early on, and we can help provide some of that, and to sort of navigate that sort of myriad of different potential pitfalls of going down the wrong path. And lastly, I think that Vmic is able to help kind of close the loop, in the sense that academia produces a lot of not just products and from product development perspective, but also new ideas and innovation comes through and is taken over by industry. And what Vmic can do is help sort of close the loop back to academia by taking those industrialized products, processes, and then training and providing knowledge and information on how that's been used within industry back into academia, so they're aware of that. I think with that, I will draw to a close, as I may have overrun by a few minutes, so I apologise for that. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thanks to you, Matthew, for such an interesting presentation on Vmic, which of course we're all interested in and supporting in some way. Before introducing our next speaker, apologize to Parisa Meysami. She's our early career researcher assisting in selecting questions for the panelists at the end of this session. So please do enter questions in the Q&A session at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It's now my pleasure to introduce Mike Whelan, currently project leader for CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. Mike has a very large portfolio within CEPI that includes vaccines for Rift Valley fever, platform technologies, and certainly more recently 4 COVID-19 projects. So Mike, very interested in hearing your talk. Off to you.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much for the invite. Okay, here we are. Yeah, for those of you that don't know, now hopefully by now you do know who CEPI is, but when we started, nobody really did. Sarah hit the nail on the head this morning, really. There was a lot of fallout from the Ebola outbreak, and actually CEPI was one of them. And the whole idea was this should never happen again. And of course it did, at a much bigger scale. But the idea was to set up this global partnership with the lofty goal of making epidemics and pandemics no longer a threat to humanity. Now, clearly we haven't got there yet, but having a coalition like CEPI is really quite unusual because it means we interact with everyone. We're non-profit making, but we work with pharma, we work with academia, regulators, governments, we work with everyone. And the C in CEPI stands for coalition, and that's a really important thing for us. Now, when we started, we were working very much along the lines of the WHO blueprint list for diseases which could cause an epidemic, and frankly, nobody was doing anything about. So we started with Lassa, Nipah, and MERS. And it was a good starting point. And, you know, we were fortunate enough to work with both Robin and Sarah on these, and it was great because we managed to get ahead of the game a little bit. We also did some platform technologies, and I absolutely take on board Sarah's comment earlier on. Platforms are key to this. We would like to have had a little bit more time to develop those platforms, but unfortunately COVID-19 didn't read our project plan. So we tried to get ready for it, but we could only do what we could do. We extended, after the first 3, we extended into chikungunya and Rift Valley fever. Rift Valley fever is one of my personal favorites because it's a true zoonotic disease, and let's face it, pretty much all of these are zoonoses. So unless we can start to identify these things at source, there's not much we can do. Now, the comment was made earlier on about MERS. We would have liked to have done that, but at the time we didn't have the budget, but it's certainly something we're thinking about in the future going ahead. But anyway, with all of these in the background, COVID-19 hit. And we worked on 12 candidates, of which 10 are now in active development. Now, some of that early work that we did on MERS in particular, and Disease X with Sarah and Robin and so forth, was actually really helpful because we co-funded it. Obviously, the work was going on anyway, but it was really helpful to know that we could get a march on things. Things like dose selection was actually done before the main phase 1, phase 2s were done, and that really moved things forward. We established probably one of the largest vaccine portfolios in the world for COVID-19, but we've done a lot more than that. Things like harmonizing, how do we know if they work? Tracking new variants. We're working on broadly protective coronavirus vaccines for a next generation, if you like. But through all of this, the most important thing to us, of course, is equitable access through COVAX, and I'll come back to that. Just to show you what we've supported, we started off with DNAs at Inovio. We sent some seed funding to Moderna and CureVac on RNAs. Viral vector, well, obviously the lead one was Sarah's Oxford team. We funded with AstraZeneca, we funded the procurement of 170 million doses into COVAX. And I've been working with them for the last year, and they've just been incredible. We mentioned earlier on about intranasal. I'm working with a project in Hong Kong where we're looking at a nasal installation of, it's actually an influenza virus carrying the RBD. very interesting. It's going to be very difficult to license, so we'll just have to see how that pans out. We've also been involved with things like Clover and Novavax, which I'm sure you've heard about, but we've also done some work with some new companies like Biological E and SK Bio and VBI, which is a virus-like particle. And these last three are actually new variants. So we have already started developing vaccines based on new variants. Most people seem to be using the South African strain. But I also wanted to touch on some of the things we've funded in enabling science, because it's all very well everybody doing things independently, but we do need to know, are they comparable? So things like we funded an international reference standard for SARS-2. So everybody's using the same serum with our friends at NIBSC. We've been looking at epidemiology, we've been looking at sequencing. We've set up the centralized laboratory where all of the labs in the network will use exactly the same technique. They will use the same SOPs, they will use the same reference standards, they'll use the same methodologies. And again, this is just to make our developers able to compare the results and say, is this working or isn't it? We've also been working with GISAID and NIBSC to track new variants, and we've got a funding call out at the moment for about $140 million to generate clinical data looking at new variants. So we're constantly watching what's going on. Now, coming back to COVAX, COVAX is probably one of the best things that we ever did. It's the only solution which will allow fair and equitable access of vaccines, regardless of the ability to pay. We're aiming to have 2 billion doses into COVAX at the moment, or by the end of 21. And what we heard from President Biden this morning is very, very great news. But we've also worked with a number of developers. Probably most of our doses have come from AstraZeneca so far. But it just shows that a non-profit making function will work. We have got doses out so far to at least 129 economies. This is rising by the day. We have over 80 million doses delivered into COVAX, all at non-profit. I mean, this is just incredible. So, looking at the future, COVID-19 has really changed the landscape. They're now, as I think we've all realized, there's the political will to invest in health security. We just heard from Matthew about things like Vmic. I'm not sure they would ever have got the funding if the political will hadn't been there, but now it's there. There have been revolutions in technology, things like the new mRNA vaccines, incredible. These things didn't even exist 5 years ago, and it's just amazing. And there's also the global desire to say this can never happen again. But we think developing a global end-to-end R&D system and financing model is the only way to do it. So COVAX, although it's targeted at COVID-19, we believe it should stay. And this is something that we would like to use as a model going forward. Now, one of the things they asked us to think about was reflections on academic and commercial partnerships. And it's a very big idea. So obviously in the interest of time, there's only so far we can go with this. But just some rough ideas, like where did the ideas come from? Well, it's a combination. Academia obviously is a source of ideas, but a lot of the big companies were working on platforms as well, and they were able to turn those over. Now, things like the maturity of platforms, developing them for other projects. I know this is something Sarah said earlier on, and I completely agree with her. So really developing everything there is to know. Things like there is no such thing as a platform master file in a regulatory setting. We would like to change that. Why not? Things like clinical trial methodologies we've seen in the current COVID-19 outbreak. People tend to have been combining phase 1 and phase 2, and that makes a lot of sense. They're doing things like dose optimization in phase 1s, which they never did before. And it's really speeded things up and moved things forward. It's not at the risk of safety or anything like that, but they've just made the system better. Technology transfer, this is a big one. And I've put here the lines are blurring. And what I mean by that, and I think what you guys have been doing here in the vaccine hubs is actually case in point. If 5 years ago we'd gone to most academics, we'd have had a bit of a blank expression whenever we mentioned the words GMP. Now we're getting things out of academic labs delivered properly. I mean, case in point, when Sarah transferred over to AstraZeneca, and I know because I've seen it, the package they got was, that's a commercial package. That's how you do it. And it saved so much time. And this sort of thing we really have to embed now going forward, because it is the key. I mean, I've always been of the opinion that in the lab, if you're not using an industrial process, you're frankly wasting your time. So this was great to see. That said, there are certainly problems remaining. The geographical footprint of where the manufacturing facilities are. We've heard from some of our colleagues in the low to middle income countries, there's not enough of them. We need to have these facilities ready. We need to have them available all over the world. Production in LMICs, we need to be funding that. We also need to have facilities ready. Where do we get the supplies from? We know there's a worldwide shortage of supplies, and in fact, CEPI is currently trying to do a marketplace where we can share supplies between manufacturers. But this sort of thing is going to be a major problem continuing. So, I mean, obviously, it would be fantastic if we could have a hot facility, a facility that was always on. Vmic may be just such a thing, but one is not enough. We're going to need more. And who pays for it? Who keeps these things hot? Who keeps them going? And of course, equitable access is central to everything we do. We want vaccines for everyone, regardless of the ability to pay. Now, I'm sure you've all seen this graph, but I think it's an amazing picture. In COVID-19, it took only 300 days from virus characterization to submission of phase 3. That's amazing. CEPI comes to the end of its funding cycle at the end of 2021. So we're going to launch CEPI 2.0 next year. We want to change that to 100 days. How do you do that? Well, we think there are 3 pillars. Prepare. We've got to be ready this time. We've got to develop vaccines for known threats. They've got to be ready. They've got to be stockpiled. They've got to be developed. We've got to transform. We want to make a library of vaccines for families of viruses so that we're ready when something similar comes along. Can we compress that timeline down to 100 days? It's aspirational. If we don't make it, it doesn't really matter, but at least it'll be faster than anybody's ever done it before. And we want to connect. We want a global network of lab capacity, manufacturing capacity, preclinical, clinical, all of that needs to be ready to go because this will happen again. And I think from what we've heard today, UK academia and industry has shown, you know how to do this. Let's do it together. Thank you.
And thanks to you very, very much, Mike, for such an excellent presentation on your work and all of the activities from CEPI. May I ask for poll 3 to be shown on the screen? So just please do take the time as we're handing over to new panelists to please answer this question at any time during the Q&A session when time does allow. But I do want to thank the speakers, Matthew and Mike, for their excellent presentations and introduce 2 experts as part of our session 3 panel. First, Professor Gordon Dougan, head of pathogen research and a member of the board of management at the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute in Cambridge. He's also an honorary professor at the University of Cambridge and a fellow of Wilson College, Cambridge, also a massive contributor to Wellcome Trust and their goals, and a recent winner of the Albert B. Sabin Gold Medal. So congrats, Professor Dougan. Also like to welcome Professor Brendan Wren, Professor of Microbial Pathogenesis and Dean of Faculty of Infectious and Tropical Diseases at the London School of Health and Tropical Medicine. So Parisa is helping to sort through questions that are popping up. And I would like to begin with a question for Gordon to ask, what lessons can we learn from how the UK has restructured how the UK has restructured the manufacturing sector in the 20th century? What can we learn from that to inform us on how to move forward in a better way in the 21st century?
Thanks, Ben. So I think I'm probably one of the few people alive who was working in the vaccine industry when we were completely autonomous in the UK. We made all of our own vaccines. We had discovery, development, clinical trials, regulatory, manufacturing, all on site, and we exported. And that was through the Wellcome Foundation and GSK. And we went through this fallow period from around 1990 to more recently, where the only people that stayed in the game were the people, you know, the Jenner in Oxford and some people at Imperial. And I think one of the standouts to the Jenner and to Adrian and Sarah is not because of what they've done this year, but it's more about what they did for the last 20 years when they had the resilience and guts to stay in the system, which was not working for them. I think that was one of the points I'd quite like to make. But when you think about, you know, what we should do next, so I've got a little tick box. I've got a tick box against discovery. I think we're very good at discovery in the UK, very innovative, particularly with my work at the Wellcome, I've seen that. Development, you know, we've got Vmic and we've got Oxford, and we've heard from Mike about CEPI. I think we're very, you know, capable in that area. We could probably expand it down at Portland places. Clinical trials, without doubt, we're excellent. You know, the UK has got a tremendous reputation now, rightly, for the work they've done on trials. And regulatory, I've been working at the MHRA for the last several months on their expert panel, and I can tell you the MHRA is fit for purpose and ready to, you know, it's a high quality regulatory organization. So the question then is about manufacturing. It's quite an interesting one, really, because ironically, we've had one of the biggest vaccine manufacturers in the world, GSK, in the country for the last 50 years, but they manufacture abroad. They manufacture mainly in Belgium, and it's probably a big part of the EU legacy. And they've got an enormous city almost for making. So we wouldn't want to replicate that, but what we could do, our companies like GSK, but also interestingly AstraZeneca, are they going to start to manufacture more locally? And there's lots of other companies coming through that we're looking at in the MHRA who are bidding to introduce vaccines, Moderna, for example, into the UK, and will they start to manufacture? And the other thing, will the government participate? So we could start to manufacture our own, you know, vaccines through a private or a public enterprise. We have a choice. And the last thing is, you know, which vaccines will we manufacture? You know, will we manufacture every vaccine, children's vaccines? Flu vaccines, we do manufacture flu locally, for example, in Liverpool. So the question then is, what vaccines would the UK want to manufacture? And the last point I'll make is, I think for people listening in from LMICs, you will hear many, many reasons why you cannot manufacture locally. We've heard some of them, the IP barriers, the lack of expertise and lack of skills. But what I would say to you that you must battle through all of those barriers if you're ever going to actually be autonomous and be able to manufacture locally, which I think is needed now after we've seen the problems of vaccine inequity. Do not be persuaded by people who say we cannot do this because of X, Y, and Z, because if you think about all of the barriers, you'll never get through them. And I would encourage and the Wellcome Trust and other organizations that we should facilitate and try to help local manufacturing capacity be built, but also the capacity investigators in discovery, development, trials, regulatory, and all levels of vaccine manufacturing to be built across the globe. That's my speech. But I'm happy to now hand over, because of time, to other people. And also, as you know, Matt, Ben, I've written a blog on this. So I have a blog. If you do go gdugan.blog, you'll find a little blog on this area, which you might find time to read if you're interested. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thanks for your response, Gordon. And I also encourage people to read anything from you, because it's always informative and it's just excellent resource.
And can I just make one final point? I want to thank the hub itself, you, Ben, particularly, and all the hub people for allowing me to participate. It was preemptive, really, and in preparation for what's happened in the last year. So thanks for that.
Well, obviously, it's returned. Massive thanks to you and all of the other vaccine experts and researchers involved. Thanks for everything. You mentioned clinical expertise and success in the UK, and that brings me to my next question for Mike, which is, are we at the precipice of being able to change vaccine clinical development? Can we create more standardized ways of merging phase 1, 2, 3? Are we stuck to how that's worked over the past few decades? What are our options in moving forward there?
Well, it's obviously going to be a stepwise process, and obviously safety is paramount. but I think the regulator, and certainly Sarah alluded to this earlier on, the regulators have been very open to having rolling submissions and saying things don't have to be the standard 1, 2, 3 paradigm that we've had previously. Also, the other thing that we noticed is a lot of the preclinical toxicology studies for COVID-19 were actually done in parallel with the phase 1. That's a real sea change. So I think it'll come with time, but you know, we can't do everything at once. And if we were, that would be far too risky. But I think the conversations are there, and I'd be interested to hear if any of my colleagues think otherwise. But certainly I think the regulators have been very open, but you know, they look at safety number 1, and we totally agree with them.
Thank you, Mike. And we should all thank the regulators. I mean, based in the UK, particularly the MHRA, as Gordon has pointed out as well, have been massively more than special in carrying out all of the important activities over the past year. So thanks to everyone from the MHRA in particular. A question for Matthew. Now this comes from the Q&A section, but I'll expand on it a bit because it was an early question in the program, which is how can the UK manufacturing capability be built? So in particular, how could the Vmic contribute in a better way for global health security through its infrastructure investments from the UK government?
Thank you. It's a great question. So, you know, I think probably the first thing to say is actually let's have a look at what we've actually done so far. So, you know, the UK really has demonstrated its ability to be able to rapidly respond to the pandemic. You know, was it perfect? No. You know, did highlight some gaps in for example, in capacity and infrastructure. But nonetheless, you know, let's not sort of forget what actually was achieved. You know, went from having things we heard earlier today, you know, a sequence became available in January, and by October we were mass producing vaccine in tens of millions of doses. So, you know, we had the ability to do it, but I think there are lessons to be learned and things that we can do and improve on. And one of the things, you know, Vmic unfortunately was not built at that time, so we weren't quite ready. But one of the things we will have going forward is as Vmic comes online, is to actually have some of that capacity and capability, not just to be able to manufacture for the country on a tens, nay, hundreds of millions of doses scale, but perhaps even more importantly, it's got the capacity to really facilitate that early transition out of discovery and into the clinic. You know, one of the things that I heard on innumerable occasions from people was how difficult it was for people to be able to access facilities that can make GMP material, but where they only needed a few tens of doses or 100 or 200 doses. You know, everyone was, all the sort of big manufacturers were like, oh yeah, you know, if you want to make 20 million doses, we can do that. If you want to make, you know, 200 doses, not really interesting because it's just not worth it. So one of the things that Vmic will help to do is to sort of bridge that gap and provide a facility whereby, you know, people can, early developers, academics, you know, anyone with sort of early stage programs will be able to, you know, quickly and rapidly manufacture material to be able to go forward into onto the clinic. And I'd also reiterate a point that Mike made a little earlier on about the importance of using, you know, industrial technology to be able to do that. So don't just go and do something that's expedient and easy to do it in the lab if it then means that we then can't industrialize it. So, you know, use the knowledge that's out there now to use platforms, you know, media components, separation technologies, whatever it is, you know, make sure you're using things that are scalable, that are industrializable. And that again is something where Vmic will very specifically be able to help.
A new question has popped up with the help of Parisa, which is asking whether there's a model whether Vmic is a model that's being used for other countries. For example, is it a model that can be used to establish similar infrastructures in African regions?
So I think the short answer is yes, and actually there has been considerable interest from a number of different countries, from in particular Africa, Latin America, Asia, of all countries have all approached Vmic and the UK government about trying to find out more about how Vmic was set up, how it runs, and could they do something similar in their regions. And I think there's absolutely an opportunity to be able to do that, and I think that's something that we can help do as well. We're not here to be overly competitive or anything. We're a not-for-profit company. We're here to sort of help the sector move forward. So that's absolutely part of what we're here to do.
Thank you, Matthew. Turning to Professor Brendan Wren, what lessons can be learned from global manufacturing and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines during the pandemic? How can we be better prepared for the next one?
I think there are two major lessons from the COVID pandemic. Firstly, we do need vaccines for all, and that we need more than one or two vaccine platform technologies for better coverage. And in terms of vaccines for all, I think COVAX is a shining example, but we do need local manufacture, and it's very heartening today to see the presentations from Vietnam, Bangladesh and Indonesia, and certainly India leads the way in this. I noticed there's some questions about what about sub-Saharan Africa, and I'd like to highlight the work done at the Institut Pasteur in Senegal that I've visited a couple of times, and their vaccine production program, Yellow Fever, is really excellent, and they're expanding this through a new science park outside Dakar. So I think there's real encouragement there. The biggest driver for vaccines for all is inevitably lower cost, but I think there's real encouragement here from several new technology platforms being developed to reduce cost and to make these processes simpler. So from my own experience, this includes making glycoconjugate vaccines in E. coli, which we've been developing for 20 years now, whereby the E. coli cells, they act like mini factories for their single-step purification of glycoconjugate vaccines. So it's a simple plug and play system that can be transferred to low and middle income countries. And we are really indebted to VaxHub for getting us to the next stage in terms of upscaling this technology for these platforms. In particular, this has been against pneumonia, but for other vaccines as well, including multi-drug resistant bacterial infections are also in the pipeline. We do need to have more than one vaccine platform technology. We've heard a lot about the RNA and adenovirus approaches that have been very effective, but we do need to continue to develop more novel platform technologies. Fighting pandemics, it will be a case of horses for courses. And I am quite often asked about the next pandemic, but I would argue that we are actually in the midst of a slow pandemic. Antimicrobial resistant bacteria, for which we have no vaccines, is a major problem. And it's a huge current threat and future threat as well. So we do need to develop vaccines, beyond vaccines, beyond viruses that cause acute pandemics. So I think overall we're really in exciting times, and we're going through a real golden era for vaccine development and production, with several new technology platforms being developed that will mean vaccines for all. And there's never been a better time to be in vaccinology, and now we have significant public and political support. It's up to us to take the opportunity with the appropriate support.
Well, thank you, Professor Wren, for that. I'd like to thank you and the other speakers, panelists of today's session 3 session. Parisa, massive thank you for your support today as well. And I would like to thank Sarah and Robin for answering so many questions everywhere on the Q&A and chat section. It was very, really helpful. Can we show now the results from the poll 3 question? So the strongest, the highest number of the responses goes to stronger collaboration and network creation for which of the following should be given highest priority to ensure better pandemic preparedness at 55%. This was followed by local vaccine production at 30%, training and upskilling 10%, better infrastructure for vaccine distribution at 4%, and at the bottom, formulation and stability studies. So thanks to everyone for participating in that poll.